The last thing Elvis Presley wanted that night was to see another person. The last song had ended. The last note was still hanging somewhere in the air. Outside the dressing room, thousands of fans were screaming his name so loudly that the walls seemed to tremble. Elvis! 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 But Elvis wasn't smiling anymore. He had given them everything. The voice, the movement, the energy, the king. Now he was exhausted. He stood alone in front of a mirror, slowly removing one piece of jewelry at a time. For the audience, he had been larger than life. For the people backstage, he was still the most famous man in the building. But in that quiet room, with the stage lights disappearing behind him, Elvis looked less like a king and more like a tired man who desperately wanted 5 minutes of peace. He glanced at the clock. He was ready to leave. Then came 3 quiet knocks on the door. Elvis stopped. He looked toward the entrance. "Come in." The door opened. A nervous staff member stepped inside. "Mr. Presley." Elvis looked at him through the mirror. "Yes?" The man hesitated. "There's someone waiting for you." Elvis sighed. "Who?" The staff member swallowed. Then he said 2 words. "John Wayne." Elvis slowly turned around. For a moment, he thought he had heard wrong. "John Wayne?" The man nodded. "He's backstage." Elvis stared at him. The Duke, John Wayne, one of the biggest names in American cinema. A man whose voice alone could fill a theater. A man who had spent decades playing cowboys, soldiers, outlaws, and heroes. A man millions of Americans thought they knew. And now, he was waiting for Elvis Presley. But Elvis had one question. Why? The staff member didn't know. "He just said he wanted to talk to you." Elvis looked toward the door. Something about that answer bothered him. John Wayne hadn't sent a message. He hadn't asked for a photograph. He hadn't come with a group of reporters. He hadn't asked to be introduced on stage. He had simply come backstage and asked to see Elvis. Alone. Elvis slowly put his jacket back on. "Where is he?" The hallway was almost empty. That was unusual. Normally, backstage after an Elvis performance was chaos. Managers, musicians, technicians, security, friends, people asking for something, people wanting something, people wanting to be near him. But tonight, the corridor was strangely quiet. Elvis walked slowly. His footsteps echoed against the floor. Then he heard another sound. A deeper voice somewhere around the corner. A man's voice. Calm, measured, unmistakable. Elvis stopped walking. The voice became clearer. Then John Wayne stepped into view. And suddenly, the hallway felt too small for 2 men who had become symbols of an entire generation. John Wayne stopped. Elvis stopped. They looked at each other. No cameras, no audience, no applause, no movie set, no stage. Just 2 American icons standing face to face under the dull backstage lights. Wayne smiled first. "Evening, Elvis." Elvis smiled. "Mr. Wayne?" Wayne shook his head. "John." Elvis nodded. "John?" They shook hands, but neither man immediately let go. It was almost as if each understood something about the other before a single serious word had been spoken. John Wayne had spent decades being watched. So had Elvis. Both men knew what it meant to enter a room and instantly change its atmosphere. Both knew what it meant to have strangers believe they understood them. And both knew what it felt like to become so famous that sometimes people forgot you were human. Wayne finally released Elvis's hand. He looked at him carefully. Then he asked something so ordinary that Elvis almost laughed. "How are you doing?" Elvis smiled. "I'm good." Wayne didn't smile back. He simply watched him. Elvis noticed. "Really?" Elvis said. "I'm good." Wayne nodded slowly. "That's what everybody says." Elvis looked at him. What? When they're not. Silence. The smile disappeared from Elvis's face. For a second, neither man spoke. Then Elvis gave a quiet laugh. You always talk like that? Wayne smiled. Only when I mean it. They walked into a small private room. The door closed, and with that single movement, the outside world disappeared. No fans, no reporters, no photographers, no people shouting Elvis's name, no one asking John Wayne for another autograph. For the first time that evening, neither man had to perform. Elvis sat down. John Wayne sat across from him. There was a brief silence. Then Wayne looked around the room. You know what's strange? Elvis raised an eyebrow. What? Everybody out there thinks tonight was about them. Elvis smiled slightly. It usually is. Wayne shook his head. No. He looked directly at Elvis. Tonight was about you. Elvis didn't answer. Wayne continued. You walked onto that stage and thousands of people saw the king. He paused. But I don't think they saw Elvis. The words landed differently. Elvis leaned back. For years, people had called him the king. At first, he had embraced it. Then he had learned to live with it. Eventually, it had become impossible to separate the man from the name. Elvis Presley had become an image, a hairstyle, a voice, a pair of eyes, a famous smile, a white suit, a guitar, a microphone, a movement that millions had copied, a legend that millions had built. But somewhere underneath all of that, there was still a young man from Tupelo who had once dreamed of becoming a singer. John Wayne understood something about that transformation, because the world had done the same thing to him. People didn't simply say John Wayne. They said the Duke. And the Duke was expected to be fearless, strong, confident, unbreakable. The Duke never hesitated. The Duke never looked weak. The Duke always knew what to do. But John Wayne knew the truth. The Duke was a character the world had created. John Wayne was the man who had to live underneath it. He looked at Elvis and quietly said, It's a strange thing, becoming somebody everybody thinks they know. Elvis lowered his eyes. Then he said, Yeah. One word, but Wayne heard everything inside it. For several minutes, neither man talked about careers. They didn't discuss box office numbers. They didn't discuss record sales. They didn't talk about Hollywood parties. They didn't talk about fame. Instead, they talked about something neither of them could escape. Expectations. The expectation that Elvis should always be Elvis. The expectation that John Wayne should always be John Wayne. The expectation that legends don't get tired, that legends don't become afraid, that legends don't have bad days, that legends don't feel alone in a crowded room. Elvis looked toward the closed door. Outside, he could still faintly hear the fans. Thousands of people, all waiting for him, all wanting something from him. He shook his head. Sometimes, he stopped. Wayne waited. Elvis continued. Sometimes I wonder if people even know who they're cheering for. Wayne's expression changed. He leaned forward. I know exactly what you mean. Elvis looked at him. Wayne continued. They're cheering for what they believe you are. A pause. Not necessarily for who you are. Elvis was silent. That sentence had hit somewhere deeper. Because it was true. The audience didn't know the hours before the show. They didn't know the exhaustion. They didn't know the private doubts. They didn't know what happened after the applause disappeared. They saw Elvis walk onto the stage. They saw the smile. They heard the voice. They screamed. And then they went home believing they had seen everything. But they hadn't. Not even close. John Wayne leaned back. Then Elvis asked the question, You ever get tired of being the Duke? Wayne laughed softly. It wasn't the laugh audiences knew from his movies. It was quieter, more human. Every man gets tired of being somebody else. Elvis looked at him. Wayne's smile faded. But the dangerous part, he paused, is when you forget who you were before. Elvis didn't respond. Wayne continued, because once the world gives you a name, he looked directly into Elvis's eyes. Sometimes it doesn't want the real man back. The room became completely silent. Elvis stared at the floor. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "So what do you do?" Wayne looked at him, and for the first time that night, his answer wasn't the answer of an actor. It wasn't the answer of the Duke. It was the answer of a man who had spent decades carrying the same burden. You protect the man underneath. Elvis looked up. Wayne's voice became softer. Because sooner or later, he paused. The applause stops. Elvis's expression changed. Outside the room, the crowd suddenly erupted again. "Elvis!" The sound came through the walls. Wayne looked toward the door, then back at Elvis, and he said something that Elvis would remember long after the night was over. The question is, when the room goes quiet, do you still know who you are? Elvis said nothing. The king of rock and roll had no answer, not yet. And John Wayne wasn't finished, because he hadn't come backstage merely to encourage Elvis. He had come to tell him something about fame that very few people ever understood, something painful, something personal, something that could change the way Elvis looked at his own life. John Wayne leaned forward. Elvis watched him carefully. Then Wayne lowered his voice. "There's one thing nobody tells you about becoming a legend." He paused. The noise outside suddenly faded. Elvis waited. Wayne looked directly into his eyes, and then he said, "Sometimes the world falls in love with the legend and forgets the man." Elvis didn't blink. For the first time that night, he wasn't listening as the king. He was listening as Elvis. And what John Wayne was about to tell him next would make this conversation far more personal than either man had expected.
For a few seconds, Elvis didn't move. John Wayne's words remained in the room like an echo. Sometimes the world falls in love with the legend and forgets the man. Outside the door, thousands of people were still waiting. They wanted Elvis. They wanted the king. They wanted the man they had seen under the lights. But inside that quiet room, John Wayne was asking Elvis to think about something nobody else seemed willing to ask. Who was he when nobody was watching? Elvis looked down at his hands. Then he slowly smiled. Not the famous smile, not the smile he gave photographers. A smaller one, a tired one. "You know," Elvis said quietly, "sometimes I don't know anymore." John Wayne didn't interrupt. Elvis continued. "Everybody wants something." His voice became softer. "They want a song. They want a picture. They want a piece of you. They want to know where you're going, who you're with, what you're doing." He paused. "And sometimes," he looked up, "you just want somebody to leave you alone." Wayne nodded. "I know." Two simple words, but they carried years behind them. John Wayne leaned back in his chair. He had spent decades surrounded by people, directors, producers, actors, reporters, fans, studio executives, people who wanted his time, people who wanted his name, people who wanted him to be exactly what they believed John Wayne should be. But the public rarely saw what happened after the cameras stopped. They didn't see the silence. They didn't see the exhaustion. They didn't see the private moments when a famous man could sit in a room surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. Wayne looked at Elvis. "You know what fame does?" Elvis waited. "It makes people think they have a right to you." Elvis slowly nodded. Wayne continued. "They think because they bought a ticket, they own a piece of your life." Elvis smiled bitterly. That's exactly it. Wayne looked toward the closed door.
And the more they love you, he paused, the harder it becomes to tell them no. That sentence hit Elvis harder than the others because he knew. He had learned how dangerous yes could become. Yes to another performance, yes to another appearance, yes to another photograph, yes to another request, yes to another person who needed something. Eventually, saying yes to everyone could mean saying no to yourself. Elvis looked at Wayne. Did you ever say no? Wayne laughed. Not enough. Elvis laughed too. For a moment, the tension disappeared, but then Wayne became serious again. That's the trap. What trap? Thinking being strong means never stopping. Elvis looked at him. Wayne continued. People see a man like me and think strength means you keep walking no matter what. He leaned forward. But sometimes the strongest thing a man can do, he paused, is admit he's tired. Elvis looked away. Those words were uncomfortable because Elvis was tired, more tired than he wanted anyone to know. But admitting it felt almost impossible. The king wasn't supposed to be tired. The king was supposed to walk onto the stage and make the room explode. The king was supposed to smile. The king was supposed to deliver. Every night, every show, every time. But behind that image was a human being, and human beings get tired. The room became quieter. Elvis stood and walked toward the window. He looked down at the street. People were still gathered outside. Even after the concert had ended, some fans remained, waiting, hoping to see him, hoping to touch the car, hoping for one final glimpse. Elvis stared at them. They don't know me. Wayne stood beside him. No. Elvis shook his head. They think they do. Wayne looked through the glass. They know the part you give them. Elvis remained silent. Then he said something almost painfully honest. Sometimes I miss being nobody. Wayne turned toward him. Elvis smiled faintly.
Before all this, he gestured toward the window. Before the screaming, before the cameras, before everyone wanted to know everything. Wayne didn't laugh. He understood. Do you remember what it felt like? Elvis nodded. Yeah. What did you want back then? Elvis thought about it. For several seconds he didn't answer. Then, to sing? Wayne smiled. That's it? That was it. No empire, no mansion, no headlines, no millions of fans. Just music. Elvis wanted to sing. Wayne looked at him. Then don't lose that man. Elvis looked back. Wayne's voice became firm. Everything else can change. He pointed toward the stage outside. The lights can change. Then toward Elvis's clothes. The clothes can change. Then toward the world outside. The audience can change. He paused. But if you lose the reason you started, Wayne shook his head, then none of the rest matters. Elvis lowered his eyes. For a moment, he looked almost like that young boy again.
The boy before the fame, before the title, before the world decided he was the king. Then Elvis asked something unexpected. John. Wayne looked at him. Do you ever regret it? The question hung in the air. Wayne didn't answer immediately. He walked back to the chair, sat down, and stared at the floor. Finally he said, regret what? Becoming John Wayne. Wayne looked up. Elvis continued. Being famous. Wayne thought about it, then smiled. Some days. Elvis waited. But if you ask me if I'd trade it all. Wayne shook his head. No. Why? Because it gave me things I never could have imagined. He paused. People. Friends. Memories. Work I was proud of. Then his expression became serious. But every gift has a price. Elvis nodded slowly. What was yours? Wayne looked directly at him. My privacy. That answer was simple, but it said everything. Elvis understood immediately. Then Wayne told Elvis something he rarely said out loud.
He explained that there were moments when he would leave a film set, drive somewhere alone, and sit in silence. No entourage, no cameras, no people calling his name, just silence. And in those moments, he could finally breathe. Elvis listened. Then he asked, "Did you ever tell anybody that?" Wayne smiled. "Not many." "Why?" "Because everybody expects the Duke to have all the answers." Elvis laughed softly. "And you don't?" Wayne smiled. "Hell no." They both laughed. For the first time, the conversation felt less like two celebrities talking and more like two old friends who had somehow found each other at exactly the right moment. But then John Wayne became serious again. He looked directly at Elvis. "There's something you need to understand." Elvis waited. "When you become famous, people start telling you what you should be." He counted them off slowly. Your manager, your friends, the studio, the audience, the newspapers, everybody. He leaned forward.
And if you listen to all of them long enough, he paused, you stop hearing yourself. Elvis stared at him. That sentence cut deeper than anything else, because maybe that was the real danger. Not fame, not money, not attention, but losing your own voice beneath the voices of everyone else. Elvis looked toward the mirror. For a moment, he saw the reflection everyone else saw. The hair, the clothes, the jewelry, the famous face. Then he looked into his own eyes and wondered how much of the man underneath was still there. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Both men looked up. A staff member opened it slightly. "Mr. Presley?" Elvis turned. "They're ready for you." Elvis frowned. Ready for what? The car. He was supposed to leave. The night was over. The audience was gone. The building was emptying. It was time to go. Elvis nodded. Okay. The staff member closed the door. Silence returned. John Wayne stood. Their conversation was coming to an end.
Elvis looked at him. "I appreciate this." Wayne nodded. "Good." Elvis smiled. "No one talks to me like this." Wayne smiled back. "Somebody should." They shook hands, but before Elvis could walk away, Wayne stopped him. "Wait." Elvis turned. Wayne reached into his jacket. For a moment, Elvis wondered what he was doing. Then Wayne simply pulled out a small piece of paper. He handed it to Elvis. Elvis looked at it. "What is this?" Wayne smiled. "Something I wrote down a long time ago." Elvis unfolded it. His eyes moved across the words. He didn't say anything. Wayne watched him. Then Elvis looked up. "What does this mean?" Wayne answered. "It means don't let the world tell you what you're worth." Elvis folded the paper carefully, put it into his pocket, and nodded. "Thank you." Wayne opened the door, then stopped. He looked back at Elvis, and his voice became quieter. "There's one more thing." Elvis waited.
Wayne said, "Don't forget the boy who wanted to sing." The door closed. John Wayne disappeared down the hallway. Elvis remained alone. His hand slowly moved to the pocket where he had placed the note. Outside, the crowd was gone. The building was nearly silent. The king could finally leave. But Elvis didn't move. He stood there in front of the mirror, looking at himself. For the first time that night, he wasn't asking what the audience wanted. He wasn't asking what the record company wanted. He wasn't asking what Hollywood wanted. He wasn't asking what the world expected. He was asking one question. "What does Elvis want?" And before he could answer, something unexpected happened. The door opened again. Elvis turned. A staff member stood there. But this time, he wasn't alone. He looked nervous. "Mr. Presley." Elvis stared at him. "What is it?" The man hesitated. "John Wayne asked me to give you one more message before he leaves." Elvis's expression changed. "What message?" The staff member looked down at the floor, then slowly raised his eyes, and what he said next made Elvis completely silent. He said, "You need to be careful about the people who love Elvis Presley, but don't know the man." Elvis stared at the doorway. John Wayne was already gone, but his words remained. And now Elvis had to face the question he had spent years avoiding. Who was really standing behind the king?
The door slowly closed. John Wayne was gone. But Elvis remained exactly where he was. He stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door, as if the conversation might somehow continue through it. Outside, the building was becoming quieter. One by one, the voices disappeared. The footsteps faded. The equipment stopped moving. The lights that had burned so brightly only minutes earlier were being switched off. The night was ending. But inside Elvis Presley, something had just begun. He reached into his pocket. The small piece of paper John Wayne had given him was still there. Elvis unfolded it. He read the words again, then again. And for a long moment he simply stood there. No smile, no performance, no king. Just Elvis, the man behind the name, the man underneath the clothes, the man who had once been a young boy with nothing but a dream. A boy who hadn't known what fame was. A boy who didn't care about being famous. He only wanted to sing. Elvis slowly sat down, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to remember who he had been before the world knew his name. He remembered the beginning, the small rooms, the uncertain days, the first moments when music became more than music. It became escape. It became hope. It became a way out. Back then, Elvis didn't dream about becoming a legend. He dreamed about becoming good enough for somebody to listen. He dreamed about standing on a stage and making people feel something. That was all. But then everything changed. The crowds became bigger. The records became more successful. The cameras multiplied. The money grew. The name became enormous. And eventually, the dream became an industry. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had advice. Everyone wanted something.
And somewhere along the way, Elvis had learned to answer the question, what does everyone else want Elvis Presley to be? But perhaps he had forgotten to ask, what does Elvis Presley want to be? That was the question John Wayne had left him with, and it was harder than Elvis expected. The next morning, the world moved on. Newspapers talked about Elvis's performance. Fans talked about the concert. Photographs appeared. People discussed the clothes, the songs, the movements, the applause. The king was everywhere. But almost nobody knew about the room backstage. Almost nobody knew that two of America's biggest legends had sat together and talked about loneliness. Almost nobody knew that John Wayne had spoken to Elvis not as a celebrity, but as a man. And that was probably exactly how Wayne wanted it. Because the most important conversations aren't always the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're the ones that happen after the cameras disappear.
Later, Elvis found himself thinking about something Wayne had said. The applause stops. It was such a simple sentence, but it carried enormous weight. Because Elvis had spent years chasing applause, not because he didn't love performing, he did. He loved music, he loved the stage, he loved the connection with the audience. But applause could become dangerous when you started believing you needed it to know you mattered. And Elvis had lived long enough to understand that applause was temporary. The lights came on, the audience screamed, then the show ended, the lights went off, and the room became quiet again. That was the part nobody saw, the silence after the applause, the empty hallway after the crowd disappeared, the hotel room after the concert, the car ride home, the moment when the costume came off, the moment when the makeup disappeared, the moment when there was nothing left to perform. That was when a man had to live with himself. And perhaps that was what John Wayne had been trying to tell him. Don't become addicted to the person everyone else needs you to be, because one day you may forget the person you were. Days passed, but Elvis didn't forget the conversation. He remembered the way John Wayne had looked at him, not with admiration, not with jealousy, not with curiosity, with recognition. That was different. John Wayne had looked at Elvis like someone who had already walked through the same fire, someone who understood the price of becoming larger than life. And Elvis realized something. Maybe that was why John Wayne had come backstage. Maybe he hadn't come to see the king. Maybe he had come to see the man. And perhaps Elvis had needed that more than he realized. One evening, Elvis was preparing for another performance. The room around him was busy. People were moving, assistants were talking, musicians were getting ready. Someone was checking the microphones.
Someone else was discussing the schedule, the usual chaos, the usual pressure, the usual expectations. Then Elvis looked at himself in the mirror. For a moment, he saw the familiar image, the hair, the clothes, the jewelry, the face the world recognized instantly. He smiled. Then he remembered John Wayne. Don't forget the boy who wanted to sing. Elvis's smile changed. He reached toward the mirror, not physically, but emotionally. He looked past the image, past the legend, past the costume, and tried to find the young man underneath, the one who loved music before he loved fame, the one who sang because he had something inside him that needed to come out, the one who had no idea what the future would bring. Elvis took a breath. Then he walked toward the stage. The lights came up. The audience exploded. Thousands of people stood. The familiar sound filled the room. Elvis! The king was back. But something was different.
Elvis didn't perform that night because he needed to prove he was the king. He performed because he remembered why he had started. There was a difference, a huge difference. He sang, he moved, he smiled, he connected with the crowd. But underneath all of it was something quieter, something more personal. He wasn't performing to become somebody. He was performing because he already knew who he was. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson John Wayne had given him. Years later, people would remember Elvis for countless things. The songs, the clothes, the performances, the movies, the records, the scandals, the triumphs, the image, the legend. But there was another side of Elvis that the public rarely saw. The man who could be quiet, the man who could be thoughtful, the man who could question himself, the man who wanted genuine friendship, the man who wanted to be understood beyond the stage. And perhaps that is why the meeting with John Wayne matters. Not because two famous men happened to stand in the same room, but because for a few minutes, two legends stopped being legends. John Wayne wasn't the Duke. Elvis wasn't the king. They were simply John and Elvis. Two men who understood that fame could give you everything the world wanted, while sometimes taking away the one thing you needed most. A place where you could simply be yourself. But there was one final thing Elvis never forgot. The note. The words John Wayne had given him. He kept it. Not because it was valuable, not because it came from a famous man, but because it reminded him of something more important than fame.
It reminded him that somewhere beneath the image, there was still a person, and that person mattered. Perhaps that's the real story behind two legends meeting. Not the photographs, not the names, not the fame, not the spectacle. The real story is what happens when someone looks beyond the legend and asks a question nobody else bothers to ask.
How are you? Not how successful are you? Not how famous are you? Not how much money did you make? Not how many people came to see you? Just, how are you? John Wayne asked Elvis that question, and for a few quiet minutes backstage, Elvis didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to be strong. He didn't have to entertain anyone. He didn't have to be the king. He could simply be Elvis. And sometimes, that is the greatest gift one human being can give another. The next time Elvis walked onto a stage, thousands of people saw the same man they had always seen. The king of rock and roll, the legend, the icon, the voice. But they didn't know what had happened behind the curtain. They didn't know that a man known as the Duke had sat across from him and reminded him of something incredibly simple. Before the world gave you a name, you already had one. Before the world created a legend, there was a human being. And before Elvis became Elvis Presley, there was simply a boy who wanted to sing. That boy was still there. He had just been buried beneath the weight of the crown. John Wayne had helped him remember. And perhaps that's why this meeting feels bigger than a celebrity encounter. Because it wasn't really about Elvis Presley meeting John Wayne. It was about two men who had spent their entire lives being watched, finally finding a moment when they didn't have to perform. Two men who understood the loneliness hidden inside fame. Two men who knew that the louder the applause became, the harder it could be to hear your own thoughts. Two men who understood that becoming a legend can be a beautiful thing, but staying human is even more important. John Wayne eventually walked away that night. Elvis eventually returned to the stage. The audience never knew what had happened, and perhaps they didn't need to, because some moments aren't meant for the crowd. Some conversations are meant to stay between two people, and sometimes the most powerful moments in the lives of legends happen when nobody is watching. Millions remembered Elvis Presley for his voice. Millions remembered John Wayne for his films. The world called one the King and the other the Duke. But behind those names were two human beings, two men who knew what it meant to carry an image larger than themselves. Two men who knew that fame could surround you with millions and still leave you searching for one person who truly understood. And on that quiet night backstage, John Wayne didn't come to see Elvis Presley. He came to see Elvis. And Elvis didn't need another fan. He didn't need another photograph. He didn't need another person telling him how great he was. He needed someone to remind him of something he had almost forgotten. The world may love the legend, but never lose the man. Because when the lights disappear, when the cameras stop, when the crowd goes home, and the applause finally fades, there is only one person left in the room. You. And if you can still recognize yourself when the room goes quiet, then perhaps you haven't lost the most important thing of all. You haven't lost yourself.